Hello, everyone. Dr. Brian Scott with you today. We're wrapping up the second week in January 2024. It's hard to believe that we have already moved into 2024 to begin with, but also that we're into ending up completing our second week already. We have been studying where we are in God's timetable in these Insight to the End Time videos, these podcasts that we've been doing on a daily basis since the end of March 2022. So we're just about completed 2 full years of these podcasts. In fact, today's podcast is number 564. And we have been sharing with you biblical scriptures that point out the signs of the end times, the end age, the last days, et cetera, et cetera. We've also been looking at world events, and I think the world events are occurring on such a scale. They're occurring so frequently, they're so condensed. There's not a time frame in between things. They're just bang, 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 that it should indicate to you that we're getting closer and closer and closer to the end. I like to illustrate it this way. When I want to go to Toronto, which is about a 2-hour drive from our city, when I leave our city and get onto the major highway, which here in southern Ontario is called 401, when I get onto 401, which is a 4-lane, 6-lane, 8-lane highway, depending on its location, there are periodic signs that say Toronto so many kilometers away. And you go great distances. You might go 25, 35, 45 kilometers in between signs because it's a great distance away. But as you get closer and closer to Toronto, let's say you're within the 80-kilometer range of Toronto, which is 50 miles away, you start seeing these signs almost every few feet, really. You start seeing the signs, and you start seeing the signs in the form of buildings, warehousing, big buildings, tall buildings. They just appear out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden you're in the midst of down the heart of the city traffic that's moving at about the snail's pace. So the closer you get to your destination, the more intense it gets. Same applies here as we get closer and closer to the end. We're in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus was asked a question, which we have been sharing with you now for 2 weeks. Verse number 3, his disciples said, "Master, what are the signs of your return, and what are the signs of the end of the age?" He begins answering their questions. And his first response is to direct them to the issue of deception. He says, take heed that no one deceives you. He refers to this in verse 4 of Matthew 24. He then refers to it again in verse 5 and in verse 11 and in verse 24. So 4 times he speaks about deception. Verse 24 says the deception will increase to the point that even the very elect could be deceived. He's referring to the most seasoned Christian believers could be deceived. And so we're getting closer and closer to that occurring. Then in verse number 6, he says, wars and rumors of wars will come along. And then in verse 7, he says, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. He then adds 3 physical events: famines, pestilence, and earthquakes. Now, I just want for a moment here today, as we're wrapping up this week, to look back over what we've shared since 2024 began. And for instance, this issue of deception, we looked at that on the 3rd and 4th of January. On the Wednesday and Thursday, the very first week of January, we studied the deception, its Greek meaning, how it leads people astray, and how it's permeating our society today in every facet. Those were episodes numbers 555 and 556, in case you want to make a note of them for future reference. Then we moved into looking at the 3 physical elements in chapter 24, verse 7. And keep in mind that Jesus is quoted in the same capacity in the book of Mark, chapter 13, and in the book of Luke, chapters 17 and 21. So these 3 writers all write about these end-time events. Matthew 24, verse 7, talks about famines, We studied this issue because it's real. It's worldwide. It's serious. It's affecting at least 10% of the world's population. In terms of people who have food shortages, that could be as high as 25%. It's a real issue, even though it may not be an issue here in North America where we have such abundance. But we studied that on last Friday, January the 5th, in episode number 557. Then we looked at earthquakes. A major earthquake occurred just as we turned into 2024 on January 1st, January 2nd over in Japan. It was a 7.5 or a 7.6 Richter scale. That's a massive quake. It's called a major quake. There were 155 aftershocks or subsequent earthquakes. And we looked at the number of earthquakes that are occurring in the world on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. It's overwhelming. Jesus said we would see earthquakes in various places. That's increasing all the time. We studied that last Saturday, January the 6th. That was episode number 558. Then we looked at pestilences. Pestilences include epidemics, pandemics, things like COVID-19, which we had a 3-year affair with, 2020 through 2023. We looked at the effect of these death sentences on people. The numbers are massive. They're staggering. And we looked at a statement made by one of the experts saying the pandemic we have experienced will be nothing compared to the pandemics that are coming or the infections that are coming as the future rolls around. We looked at that issue this past Monday, and that was episode number 559. So we've spent time to bring information to you to point out that these are not just individual words that Jesus spoke, but they really have an impact today and effect today because we are in the last days. We're in the days leading up to the very end. In other words, we're getting closer and closer to the heart of the city. And not only are there road signs indicating that, but the buildings are indicating that. The skyscrapers are indicating that. This week, we've been studying verse 6 and 7, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, in I think it's like 4 episodes that we've covered. This past Tuesday and Wednesday, we were dealing with the war issue, and we looked at the number of wars, the frequency of the wars, the intensity of the wars that are occurring. We are seeing all kinds of wars in the world today. And then this past, that was Wednesday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Thursday, yesterday, Friday, and today we're wrapping up on nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and we're seeing all kinds of impact and effect there. It's more than military. It's more than political. It's economic. It's financial. It's social. It's moral. It's an attack against everything we've stood for and that we've understood. Do you realize that these shifting values in our society today are part and parcel of this whole trend, this whole prophetic statement made by Jesus? These conflicts, they're just not occurring willy-nilly or circumstantially or coincidentally. They are part and parcel of the end time preparation for the Antichrist to come on the scene. Next week, I want to move into a realm of sharing with you of the social, moral type changes that are occurring in our society, and the fact that these shifts, we haven't seen shifts like this since the protests against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. I was part of a youth group. We were heading to a church over in Detroit, Michigan for a Friday night youth gathering in 1967 when the riots broke out in Detroit and our trip was canceled. We were teenagers. We were shocked by this. We couldn't imagine this happening in our neighboring state of Michigan, but it was real. It's getting very strong today, and next week we're going to take some time to examine this in more detail to bring you up to speed on what's going on as we approach the end times.